David, thank you so much for talking with us. Could you tell us how you first came to do research?
So I actually started as a graduate student in 1995. I was at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and we had this general class. We actually had two. We had a pro seminar about that allowed us as the new graduate cohort to meet all the faculty, and they talked about their research. Then we also had this kind of doctoral core class where they kind of went through all the different types of research. And this was so you took a qualitative and you took a quantitative. So in the qualitative, they just kind of went through all the paradigms of research. And then in our pro seminar, that was a big class. It was kind of almost an auditorium class. It was probably anywhere, I'm remembering now, it was probably about 60, 70 folks in that bigger class, because it was all 5 departments that folks took that class in. And then in the pro seminar, it was just for us in educational policy studies. So we really got a chance to do one-on-one with each faculty member. So that kind of introduced me to qualitative work on the ground and folks who were looking at things from a number of different perspectives. So that was the way in which I came to engage qualitative research or even hearing anything about it.
What did you think about it when you first heard it?
When I first heard it, the thing I always thought about was, wow, this is really stoic in terms of what it is that they're doing. But then people started to, as we started to talk about it more, people started to really dig in and talk about folks who were challenging it. So there was a book by a guy named Andrew Gitlin. He edited a piece called Power and Method. So when I was reading it, it's like, oh, okay, here's some folks who are kind of complicating it, making it a little different, talking about responsibility, accountability to communities. So that was big for me to see. And as I was ending my tenure as a graduate student, decolonizing methodologies came out. Mm-hmm. So those were kind of the bookends to say, here's some ways to do this differently. So that was really influential to my own take, because it was an example for me that the traditional statement of the purpose, literature review, methods, cite, or what have you, it complicated a bit. And then another woman who was on faculty, Wanda Pillow, she had the other qualitative class, and she got us abreast to the language of qualitative research. And then she said, well, remember, that's just the mainstream language. You can upset this. So this was, I remember in her class, I wrote a paper that I think I titled it, I Am Not a Researcher, in terms of just kind of saying, like, I'm just not conscribing to these traditional methods that really I saw really not connecting to anything. But those 3 classes were really influential in terms of providing examples of ways to interrupt the practice. But again, understanding what that interruption was, what the mainstream world is expecting, and then you figuring out what it is that you're trying to do. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. How did you deal with that really difficult triumvirate in your own dissertation research?
For me, and it's always, so in my own dissertation, I was doing a sociological analysis of a policy that was enforced in the state of California. So Proposition 209 ends effectively affirmative action in the state. And there was in that space, I had to think about, okay, in terms of policy, where do we get at the origins? What is its history? And then what is the expected implementation? Because then it hadn't been rolled out yet. Mm-hmm. So now in this rolling out of policy, where would it take folks? And more importantly, what was the rationale behind it? So for me, I was looking at, well, one, I know I have to do some archival work. Second, I have to do some policy work and look at the ways in which laws are shaped. Because in my research, what I found was there were only 2 words that were different between the Civil Rights Clause in the California Constitution and Proposition 209. right? And those 2 words changed the entire policy, right? So it was a whole new exercise in discourse analysis, right? And then using critical race theory as the frame and saying, well, if we understand racism as endemic, and we understand that higher education is understood as a property of whiteness, then now what is the rationale? How's this playing itself out? So there was this interpretive space that I had to figure out. So what universe of folks were talking about this interpretive stance? Then what strand of folks were talking about an archival historical strand? Then who was talking about sociology in relationship to policy implementation? So now pairing all 3 of those spaces for the literature, and then for method, so really kind of arguing what is a critical race method, right? So now really kind of pushing that. So if I'm centering race and the intersections of race, class, and gender in this policy, who is the affected, right? So asking this larger question, right? Did I do the best job? Probably not, right? Right.
It's your dissertation.
Right, exactly. But at the same time, just kind of pairing those things. And I think for future work, it really allowed me to kind of ask these questions around origin, around implementation, and around formation, right? And actually in the order of origin, formation, implementation, right? So kind of looking at it in that way, and it kind of guiding what I do now in terms of who is rationalizing what to what end.
Where did you go to search for the people who were speaking in the ways that you needed to hear?
Right, I got this, and it's interesting for graduate students. A lot of times when you do your work, you run across somebody who's done almost everything that you want to do, right? So for me, it was a woman named Lydia Chavez, not to be confused with Linda Chavez, right? And she wrote this book called The Colorbind. And I looked at the color, and I just kept saying to myself, why am I writing a dissertation? It's done, right? But she goes into the details of, and more so an analysis of the people who formulated 209. So Ward Connolly, then members of the California legislature. So she looks in that space. So I said, okay, this is really important. But now what I'm bringing to the table is this critical race analysis, but also this thing around the policy formation and the rationales, and how this discourse, this very simple discourse, 2 words, change the way a state understands college admissions, right? So for me, that was the process in terms of looking at it. But again, I was discouraged for a second to just say, somebody has written this thing, Jesus. All right, let me start this whole new thing. But I had advisors who said, no, what you have is different in terms of what is this theoretical frame that you're using, and then how does this theoretical frame inform policy formation, right? And then from a sociological perspective. So looking at it from all 3 of those spaces was huge for me in terms of my own discovery in the work.
That's awesome. So you graduate. Mm-hmm. What happens next? And
this is always this question around, so what, in addition to my dissertation, I ran into the work of a guy named Eric Yamamoto. Mm-hmm. And Eric Yamamoto wrote a book called Interracial Justice. And he actually, in the early 90s, wrote about what he called critical race praxis. Because for me, seeing or talking about racism as endemic or what have you, for my own self, was saying, all right, what's new? But he said, okay, we need to spend less time theorizing and more time on the ground working with people who are actually experiencing this type of marginalization and degradation. And for me, that was the aha moment, right? If we can categorize that or what have you. Because I was saying to myself, okay, we know these things to exist, but what are we doing, right? And here's somebody who said, all right, here's what we did. We created a legal clinic for garment workers in the garment district in Los Angeles, right? We had Black folks, Latinos, Southeast Asians talking to each other about how they understood this current moment, and then what could they do to protect their rights as garment workers, right? So for me, that was, so upon graduating, it was always asking this question, what was what is this praxis? Where is this praxis? Because I actually go to grad school as part of a self-induced assignment working with a community organization, right? So a couple of friends of mine say, all right, look, what would it mean to go to graduate school and bring back the resources from a place like that to the communities like the ones that we come from? So now it was to put that plan into fruition, because throughout graduate school, I was still doing that community work. So now here's the opportunity to deepen that work. So now so upon that space saying, okay, now what does it mean in terms of the larger justice-oriented work and work around critical race praxis? How do I operate as a documentarian of that work, right? Not for the sake of research, but actually because this is documentation for people who want to do this and actually expand, critique, and challenge what I'm putting forward. So really kind of thinking about the utility of the work. So that was the next step for me.
So can you talk a little bit then about what that looks like and what it has meant over the years in terms of the way that you think about yourself as engaging in research?
Right, so I always think about my own work in terms of two questions: why and for what, right? So now, if I can answer or address those questions, not necessarily have a definitive answer, but address those questions and then saying, with whom, right? So now that why and for what gets a little deeper, right? And for me, that why is, if we look at schools, just using schools as an example, the ability of young people to think and create is perpetually being challenged and eviscerated. So what are the spaces that we support and create spaces for young people to think, create, and make informed decisions for the purpose of improving their lives and the collective of their communities and schools, if we use that as an example? So I think for me, that's always where my work sits. Those are always the foundational questions in terms of the work. So it's never research for the sake of research. So if I reflect and it comes off as research for the sake of research, I just won't do it, right? But this thing around saying, who is it connected to, for what purpose, what is the utility of this work? Not for me in terms of academic trinkets like tenure, but this thing around, can community members actually utilize this work to actually inform their spaces? Can they do their own sets of work to inform their spaces? And thinking about it as ways, so method for me is much different than method that's recorded in a journal per se, or even a manuscript, right? But to say this method is one where folks who may be outside the academy, can interrogate their conditions for the purpose of actually improving them. So thinking about it in that way. And then I guess the last part of that is to understand deeply the contradictions that exist in that space, right? The traditional colonial relationship that universities have to community spaces, right? And if we understand that to be real, what are the spaces where do we interrupt that trajectory, right? And being very purposeful about that interruption.
What have been your experiences about where that interruption can best be done and where it's quite difficult to do?
I think the interruption is the most difficult in the academy, right? Because the way in which it's situated, right? So people will talk about certain things and they'll have a very traditional view of what research is. They'll talk about ethics, which really isn't necessarily ethics, but it's really just kind of keeping yourself safe in a larger context. And then the contradictions come in the form of saying, well, if I occupy this space, what does it mean to be in another space that has a justified distrust of it, right? So this thing around really understanding that and then saying and I always use this term with being in a high school with high school students, I say on the first day of class, there's no reason for you to trust me. Right? If we understand the traditional relationship between universities and community space, there's absolutely no reason for you to trust me. Right? Now, let's start there. Right? So if we engage it from that angle, it takes you into spaces like being on a design team to develop a high school, teaching a high school class as a promise in the proposal for the design team, right? So these things around where is accountability, right? And asking very difficult questions when your understandings of things may be very different from folks in the community, and then putting that all out on the table and trying to figure out the directions in which to go, right? So really kind of stepping back and suspending expertise, right? So research for me actually comes in the form of the work that I'm doing on the ground and the documentation of that work, right? For the purpose of archives and people who are interested in similar things, but to move it forward and to challenge it, right? So not to just exist in its own vacuum or bubble, what have you, right?
Yeah. What have been some of the hardest moments for you in trying to work in this way with people?
Yeah, I think, especially if you think about school spaces, right, in terms of spaces that are so contested, right, in terms of you think about schools in a place like I'm in Chicago, where schools are these very precious spaces and deeply understood and misunderstood spaces. So for me, an example of that is we had a principal leave suddenly at the high school that I work with. And the replacements were vetted by a community panel, a local school council, which was set up by the laws in Chicago. And there was a split in the panel in terms of who should be the choice for the next principal. And it became a deep rift because families wanted someone who understood them, who could talk to them, who would be very intentional about humanizing them. Other members of the panel said that might appear to be the case, but that is not what this person is doing. In fact, you have to pay attention. If this person becomes the principal, we will not have a school in less than 12 months. And because Chicago operates in this way that some people are actually placed in schools to bring about discord to rationalize its closure. So this was a huge rift, right? So everybody, the council is split. We engage in a democratic process, so this has to come to a vote. So it's all this back and forth about what's going to happen here, right? And more important than any of us here, will we have a school in 12 months? And if that person comes on, our chances are much less, right? So it was a very difficult moment in terms of kind of talking that through, right? And then after that, the person that we choose, actually, the year after she gets chosen, she's fired 2 days before the first day of school, right? So this thing is just kind of it's like this ongoing thing. Now we actually get her hired back through this whole process. But thinking about that, and I just think about the mental and physical toll that it took on folks, right? From getting this person into the door and then having her dismissed in a totally unlawful and incoherent way. So I think that's an example for me of where those tensions exist, right? So now I occupy this space as concerned community member, researcher, volunteer social studies teacher, and now all of this is coming forward and talking to folks and then hearing, well, this is a person who we think will care about us more. And that's the kind of space that we're trying to induce in the school. So that the difficulty in that saying, this person actually doesn't care and actually will do all these other things because she's demonstrated in precedent that she will do these things and has gotten votes of no confidence from other folks. So it was a heavy experience for all of us, right? And I think no one came out of that space unscarred, right? Just in real time.
How do you think about the issues? I don't know how to use words that express the question I'm trying to ask. Mm-hmm. The joy of the kind of work that you do, mm-hmm. I do related work in Malawi, is that there's no effort to take an objectivist stance or to pretend that we're not deeply and fully engaged.
Right.
But the complexities of power dynamics within every community.
Yes.
One of the things that always strikes me about people who don't know much about working with communities but want to talk about it is this assumption that you just work with the community.
Right.
Of course, there is no the community.
Right.
How have you thought and kind of experienced working those dynamics and thinking about your role as someone who is both fully engaged and whose role is not exactly the same as others there? How do you think about the role that you play in those dynamics?
I think one place where this is where those very deeply articulated agreements become important, right? Because that's accountability to spaces, right? And then what is, so, in sociology, folks often talk about a feedback loop, right? So, but this thing around, what it means to live a feedback loop, right? So this thing to say, well, what are the terms and conditions of this relationship? And then what are the measures of accountability to this space? What are the check-ins around this work? And then being very clear and always returning to that agreement, because you may need to make an adjustment. You may need to take some things out. You may need to add some things on. But understanding that those terms of agreement are always dynamic, but there's an accountability to document them and the shifts therein, right? So for me, that document of accountability is the design team proposal, right? So myself and another colleague, we write in the proposal that we will teach at the school. Right? So this thing around where does that operate, right? So when administrations shift, we always have to return to that administration and say, look, there's an agreement here, right? There's an understanding here about what it is that we do in relationship to community space. So now what does that mean? And then how are you in what ways do you demonstrate that accountability, right? So you're going to the parent night, you go to the athletic event, you are doing things after school, you're talking to folks about real life concerns, right? But these are only the ways that we build trust, and then being very intentional about, so in my own space, so I documented the whole design team process. And I said to folks, okay, this is going to come out in the manuscript, but every interview, you all are looking at the manuscript, seeing if I got this thing right. Every the drafts of pieces, let you all check that. The foreword was written by two of the hunger strikers who actually got the school, right? And both have children at the school, right? So this thing around making sure that those spaces, and it's not so much, because I think a lot of times people get into this thing around covering their bases. And it's not that, it's this thing around making sure that you are responsible to the folks that you love, right? I mean, in real ways. And that's, I think, the Linda Tui Smiths of the world, the Julia Sudburys, the Chris Hales of the world, they are challenging us to do this, right? In ways that traditional paradigms say that we should stray away from, right? And that there is a modicum of pain in doing work in that way. But I think it is a righteous pain, right? But still one that you have to be clear about where your commitment lies, and more importantly, who is in that universe of support, right? Because I think another thing that we don't mention, and I'm glad you all are having this conversation with researchers, if we don't pay attention to this thing and how it's actually affecting us mentally, physically, and spiritually, it will kill us, right? From anywhere to these strange forms of cancer, to hypertension, to depression, to anxiety, right? All of these things, right? The inability to talk to our parents, right? So all of these things, I think we need to pay attention to. And I think that's another part of our work. So if you're doing kind of justice-centered work, we also have to understand what does it mean to engage self-care for the purpose of doing the work responsibly. Yeah.
So one of the things that grad students who are interested in doing work that moves towards engaging communities long-term and carefully and with care is the IRB. And particularly when you're a grad student, I think it looms very large and scarily.
Right.
The IRB at UW, perhaps more than at some other places, is particularly poorly aligned with qualitative research methods generally.
Yeah. In most places, right?
In most places, but God. Anyway, how do you think about engaging with the IRB ethically? I'm asking that because a lot of what we end up telling our students is basically, look, say what you need to say to the IRB. Then we're going to actually sit down and talk about what this really means.
Right.
And that split is perhaps the way to go,
Right.
but it worries me.
Right, yeah, sure. And I think it's an important concern because, and just to let the cat out of the bag, the reason why most folks have this misalignment is the stuff that was happening at UIC. So in 1990,
Thanks.
right, exactly, right. So in 1995, we get, these physicians are doing these experiments without consent forms, and it changes the entire IRB process nationally, right? So I think this thing, so at most R1 spaces, IRBs are written for the medical community, right? So these folks aren't necessarily, they're just, medical folks are just now getting into focus groups or any type of interview data, right? So they're asking you about, is there a risk of disease, in the form you're saying. What,
Are you taking samples?
Right. Look, what's happening here, right? So to your point, I think the pragmatics of saying, all right, look, you're talking to a group of folks who have no idea what this thing is. For the purpose of the form, make sure that you go through their conventions. Now, that sit down, and I think that's the real intervention, right? So what does this mean? So now, it's not necessarily a second IRB, but what is this responsibility in the recording of these stories, in the recording of our interactions, in the recording of the recording and documentation of our spaces with folks in these different areas for the purpose of not exploiting them, right? So think about our conversation. So what would it mean for us to have a statement of non-exploitation, right? That we come up with in terms of our students or what have you. And now thinking about that, because I do think the practical comes out in terms of, like I said, because you're talking to a bunch of physicians, right? But this thing around now, what does it mean on the ground, right? So I think that's a way to deal with that, because that there has to be in the near future, right, that we will have some alignment with that, because they're totally despondent forms, right? So really kind of thinking about that in different ways.
Letting students feel comfortable with that
Exactly.
space between them.
That tension, right? It's just I think it's important for us as faculty members to just to go right into that tension. Just say, look, it's a pain in the ass. Nobody likes it. But think about it in terms of this allows you to do the work that you want to do in the way that you want to do it. It's documentation that you've filled out this convention, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yep.